had just stepped off a red-eye from Tokyo when my phone buzzed with the first surprise. "Welcome home, Mr. Lane." The Uber driver smiled as we sped through the Arizona desert. "But are you sure this is the right place?" he asked, eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. I glanced up from my emails to see a neighborhood I didn't recognize. Rows of freshly painted homes, paved sidewalks, matching lawns and garden flags waving gently in the wind. It looked like a gated utopia. But the problem was, this utopia was supposed to be mine, literally. I'm Elijah Lane, 42 years old, forensic accountant for federal real estate fraud investigations for over a decade. I'd just wrapped up a 6-month gig overseas and was coming back to finally settle on the 55-acre patch of land my uncle had left me, land that had been in the Lane family for generations. Only now it looked like it had been bulldozed into a suburban fantasy. I paid the driver and walked toward a shiny sign that read, "Crystal Pines, a Covenant Community." My uncle's wild mesquite trees were gone, replaced with fountains and mulch. Families pushed strollers, kids zipped by on scooters, and HO-mandated tulips lined every sidewalk. I wasn't supposed to be here, like this. It is supposed to be standing in open space, under a big sky, not staring at 120 cookie-cutter houses, built on land I legally owned. I stormed into the sales center where a realtor named Tara, blonde curls bouncing and smile professionally wide, greeted me like I was there for a house tour. "Welcome to Crystal Pines. Are you here to see our model homes for Phase 2? I pulled out a copy of my deed and held it up like a badge. "No, I'm here to find out why the hell you built Phase 1 on land that belongs to me." Her smile dropped like a curtain at closing time. There was a pause, just long enough to register that this wasn't going to be a normal day. "Oh, you must be Mr. Lane," she said, her tone shifting. "Melinda Carter, our HOA president. Said you might show up eventually. She's in the executive building, if you'd like to talk through your concerns." I followed the marble path to a building that looked like a tech startup, not an HOA office. Inside was all glass walls, brushed steel fixtures, and the smell of expensive cologne. Melinda Carter sat behind a mahogany desk like she'd been cast for the role. She looked mid-50, S-sharp, silver bob, lawyer's eyes, Stanford degree on the wall, and the kind of grin that says, "I've already won." "Elijah, so glad you're finally back in the States," she said, as if we were old friends. "Oh, we've been trying to reach you about your land for months." She slid a thick folder across the desk. Inside were certified mail receipts, notices, official-looking letters, all sent to a P.O. box in Tucson that had been shut down 2 years ago. "These communication was sent to the address listed in our records," she said sweetly. "When we received no objection, we proceeded according to HOA protocol and land development statutes per the original charter signed by your uncle in 1997. I scanned the paperwork calmly, my expression unreadable. Years of investigating financial criminals teaching me how to keep my cards close. "You built 120 homes on land I own," I said slowly. She didn't flinch. "Technically, you own a portion of land incorporated under the Crystal Pines Master Development Plan. Your uncle signed those rights over as part of a land use agreement filed in '97. We've been expanding under those parameters ever since." I pointed to one document. "This agreement expired in 2012 and was never renewed. You know that, right?" Melinda's smile flickered just slightly. "We believe there's a legal basis to continue development based on abandonment doctrines and lack of objection." "Abandonment?" I asked. "I was working for the Department of Justice overseas, not living under a rock." She shrugged. "Your presence or absence is less relevant than the paper trail. We've covered every angle, legally, morally." Then she leaned back, folded her hands, and delivered the kicker. But of course, we're prepared to offer you compensation for your cooperation, a generous package if you'd rather not pursue litigation." Her voice was sugar-laced with cyanide. I stood up with deliberate calm. "Miss Carter, I'm going to take this file now and speak with my attorney." "You do that," she said, still smiling, "but be aware, litigation could take years, and we're backed by Carrington Roth Legal. If you know the industry, you know the name." Well, I knew the name. Carrington Roth were sharks. But I was a different kind of shark. I walked out without another word, past picket fences and manicured hedges. At the corner where my uncle's favorite pecan tree once stood, I saw a decorative stone sculpture with a bench and a plaque that read, "Dedicated to the spirit of community." The irony was thick enough to drown in. That night, I didn't sleep. I went through the documents, cross-referenced them with public records, pulled county land filings and HOA disclosures until 3ID. And what I found was worse than I imagined. They didn't just take my land. They'd taken other parcels too. Older owners, out-of-state heirs. Every time the same tactic. Letters to invalid addresses. Legal notices buried in small-town newspapers. Then construction crews moving in before anyone could respond. The more I dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just bold. It was systematic. It was deliberate. And worst of all, it was smart. But they'd made one mistake. They did it to a guy who'd spent his entire career following paper trails through the fire. They picked the wrong land. And the wrong lane. The next morning, I got a text from an unknown number. "Heard you're back in town. Meet me at Crossroads Cafe at 10 a.m. Come alone." No name, no details. Which meant one thing. Whoever sent it knew I was already digging, and probably had something worth hiding or sharing. At 10 on the dot, I walked into the Crossroads, a dusty roadside diner just outside Crystal Pines. It smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee. The kind of place you pick when you want privacy, but not suspicion. She was already there. Late 20s, sharp navy mail blazer. Eyes scanning every corner of the room. When I sat down across from her, she slid a folder toward me before even saying hello. "You don't know me, Mr. Lane," she said quietly. "But I know Melanie Carter, and I know what she's done." Her name was Audrey Chen, former legal assistant for the Crystal Pines HOA. "I started working there fresh out of law school thinking I'd landed my first big break," she said, stirring her coffee but barely drinking it. Melanie was brilliant, powerful, connected, the kind of woman you admire until you see what she really is. Inside the folder were scanned emails, signed affidavits, notarized memos, and something that made my spine stiffen. A list. A spreadsheet titled Internal Opportunity Pipeline. It was a target map. Names, addresses, death dates, ownership status, next of kin, estimates of land value, and, most damning of all, columns labeled Mail Valid Y/N and estimated objection risk. They had created a hit list of vulnerable landowners and ranked them by how easy they'd be to steamroll. My name was at the bottom with an asterisk. Return date unknown. Moderate risk. "You're not the first they've done this to," Audrey said. "You're just the first to show up early." I flipped through the documents, jaw tightening with every page. "This is a criminal operation," I said flatly. She nodded. "But disguised as an HOA with just enough legal padding to make it hard to challenge." I asked why she was coming forward now. "Because your uncle helped my father once," she said, "and I know your aunt, Margaret, left you that land for a reason." She reached into her bag and handed me a second envelope. It was sealed in old wax, stamped with a faded L from our family crest. Inside was a letter. in my aunt's handwriting. Elijah, if you're reading this, it means the day has come. Melanie has been circling for years, pretending to build community while building an empire. But you were always the one who saw the angles, the patterns. You'll know what to do? Check the old grain silo beneath the floorboards. That's where the real documents are. My breath caught. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was personal. That night, I went back to the ranch, or what was left of it. The barn had been flattened, turned into a community dog park, but the old grain silo near the edge of the property still stood, half covered in vines, forgotten by the developers, too focused on their granite countertops and home theater packages. I broke the lock, climbed inside, and pried up the wooden slats, just as the letter said. There was a steel box, rusted but intact, bolted into the foundation. Inside were dozens of manila folders, each labeled in my aunt's tidy print: property fraud, forged easements, offshore accounts, audio tapes, bank statements, even a recording device wrapped in a flannel handkerchief. She'd been building a case for years, and now it was mine. I spent the next 72 hours doing what I do best: connecting dots, tracking transfers, mapping shell companies. And by the end of day 3, I had a map on my hotel wall with red thread crisscrossing from Arizona to Nevada to Oregon and back. This wasn't just about Crystal Pines. This was part of a network, a web of fake HOAs, shady developers, and real estate lawyers laundering money through fraudulent property transfers. At the center of it all, Melanie Carter. But she wasn't working alone. The emails from Audrey pointed to someone else: James Holloway, a name I knew from a Department of Justice case file. Developer lobbyist suspected of money laundering in 2019, but charges dropped. He was Melanie's silent partner, and probably the real money behind Crystal Pines. And they weren't just building houses. They were building leverage. Land grabs disguised as community growth. A housing boom built on stolen land. I called Sarah Lynn, my old DOJ contact. "You always said you'd bring me something juicy when you quit," she said after one glance at the files I sent her. I didn't think it'd come gift-wrapped with federal crimes and HOA meetings. She agreed to open an investigation but warned me, "Don't go public yet, let us build the case from the inside." But I wasn't wired for waiting. So I went to the next HOA board meeting. Crystal Pines Community Hall was full. Homeowners sipping wine, eating cheese, politely clapping every time Melanie spoke. It was theater, and I was about to crash the stage. When they opened the floor for public comment, I stepped up in my blazer and jeans, holding a USB stick. "Hi, I'm Elijah Lane. Some of you may know me as the guy whose family owned this land before it became Crystal Pines." Polite nods, a few glares. I just wanted to share a few documents I found, for transparency. I plugged the USB into the projector and clicked play. First slide. A scanned email from Melanie to James Holloway. "He's out of the country for 6 months. We should be able to secure permits by Q3. Second slide. A notarized deed forged with my uncle's signature dated 2 months after his death. Third slide. Bank transfers from HOA fees into a shell company called Cypress Legacy LLC, traced directly to Holloway's Cayman account. The room went silent. Melanie stood up, face pale, smile frozen. "Mr. Lean, this is highly inappropriate." "No, ma'am," I said calmly. "What's inappropriate is using community funds to launder profits from stolen property. That's illegal." Someone in the back gasped, and a woman stood up. "Is that where our assessment money's been going?" Others followed, murmuring voices rising into shouts. That was the crack I needed. I left the USB behind and walked out into the night. The fuse was lit, and the explosion was coming. The fallout hit faster than I expected. By morning, my inbox was full. Some emails were from homeowners thanking me for speaking up. Others were from lawyers, HOA board members, and one very polite threat from Melanie's assistant, claiming I had violated community decorum. But the real message came at 3 a.m. A rock through my hotel window. Taped to it was a note in all caps. Lead or we make you. No signature, but the handwriting looked familiar. I filed a report with local police, who nodded sympathetically and did absolutely nothing. So I did what I always do when someone tries to scare me. I dug deeper. Sarah from DOJ called that afternoon. "We've started a task force," she said, "but it'll take time. You sure you're safe out there?" I laughed. Safer than they are. What Melanie didn't realize was that every countermove she made was feeding into my case. She hired a PR firm to spin the story. Suddenly, articles were popping up on local news about an opportunistic heir trying to scam hard-working families out of their homes. Comments flooded social media accusing me of being a greedy outsider. But the more noise they made, the more people started to pay attention. Especially after the audio file leaked. It was Melanie's voice, from one of Aunt Margaret's recordings, calm and cold. "The fewer questions, the better, Jim. Just get the signatures and let the lawyers clean it up later." That clip aired on the 6 p.m. news. And just like that, the narrative flipped. Residents started demanding town halls. Melanie canceled 2 in a row, citing security concerns. Then came the lawsuits. 3 families filed claims of deceptive sales practices. Another demanded a refund after discovering their foundation had been poured without a proper inspection. Each one added weight to the case I was building. But Melanie wasn't done. She sent a cease and desist letter through Carrington Roth's top partner, threatening me with defamation, civil liability, and even trespassing. Sarah reviewed it and laughed. "This is theater," she said, "but document everything." So I did. Every message, every meeting, every shady contractor who showed up outside the silo, trying to inspect the premises. Then came the biggest blow yet. The Arizona State Real Estate Board opened a formal investigation into Crystal Pines. And that's when I knew we were close. So I triggered the next phase of the plan. At the center of Crystal Pines was a plot of land still undeveloped, Phase 3, according to the blueprints. It just so happened that my aunt had retained mineral rights beneath it. A legal separation almost no one noticed. Until now. I filed a motion to restrict land use pending review of those mineral rights, which effectively froze any further construction. Suddenly, developers couldn't move. Contracts couldn't close. Buyers backed out. And Melanie, she cracked. She called me herself. "Elijah, this has gone too far. You're hurting innocent families." "I'm not the one who built homes on stolen land," I replied. "We can settle this," she said, her voice suddenly syrupy again. "We're prepared to offer you $1 million and a full NDA. Just walk away." I paused, then said quietly, "How about this instead? You sign over the HOA to community leadership and walk away yourself." She hung up without a word. 2 days later, someone broke into the grain silo. They didn't find anything because I'd already moved everything to a secure storage unit 2 towns over. But the damage was done. They tore through the place, dumped files everywhere, spray-painted "traitor" on the silo walls. That was the final straw for the DOJ. Sarah flew in with 2 federal agents and took over. "This is no longer a private dispute," she told the HOA board. "This is a federal investigation." And then the tip came in from a woman named Rachel. She had worked with Melanie on a prior development in New Mexico. Same playbook, same fraud. Only this time, a local journalist had died in a mysterious car crash just days before, publishing a report. She sent me copies of the journalist's final drafts, mentioned Crystal Pines by name. Now, we weren't just dealing with fraud. We were looking at conspiracy. And possibly something worse. I forwarded everything to Sarah and made a public statement at the next town hall. Standing in front of the residents of Crystal Pines, I laid it all out. The fake notices, the forged documents, the off-the-book bank transfers, the manipulated inspections, and the silenced journalist. I ended with one line. This was never just about land. This was about power, and we're taking it back. That night, I got a text from an encrypted number. It read, "You just made the list." I smiled and texted back, "God, now watch what happens next." The morning I walked into City Hall, I wasn't alone. Behind me were over 40 residents from Crystal Pines. Many of them had once ignored me, avoided eye contact. Now, they followed me like a rising tide. The hearing room was packed. Lawyers, reporters, realtors, residents, and at the center of it all sat Melanie Carter in a Navy power suit. Her face calm, her hands folded, but her eyes scanning every angle of the room like a cornered animal. The City Planning Commission had been forced to hold a public review after the Arizona Real Estate Board flagged irregularities in Crystal Pines development permits. I requested the first speaking slot, and when I stepped up to the podium, I didn't hold back. I presented public records showing that my Aunt Margaret Lane had never transferred development rights beyond 2012, that no renewal had been filed or recorded with the county. Showed a time-stamped log of certified letters sent to a demolished P.O. box, proving Melanie knew the notices would never be received. Then came the contracts, fake notarizations, falsified dates, overlapping signatures, all tied to properties developed under Crystal Pines and funneled through a web of shell companies. Then I turned to face the crowd and pulled out the last piece. A high-resolution map of the underground mineral deposits beneath Phase 3. This land was never just dirt and cactus, I said, sitting on an estimated $48 million in extractable gas, and the only person who ever knew that was Melanie Carter. Melanie stood suddenly, demanding to respond, but the commissioner raised a hand. "Sit down, Miss Carter. We're not finished." I played an audio clip of her voice from a month earlier. "We don't need his permission. Jim, the old woman's dead. He's out of the country by the time he comes back. We'll have everything locked down." You could hear a pin drop. The commissioners recessed to review the material. Outside reporters surrounded me asking questions, but I said nothing until Sarah from the DOJ stepped to the mic. "It is an ongoing investigation involving multiple agencies and across several jurisdictions. We have reason to believe Crystal Pines is part of a coordinated scheme involving property fraud, financial misconduct, and environmental violations. We are pursuing every legal avenue available." Melanie was escorted out of City Hall, not in handcuffs, but close enough, her lawyer shielding her from the cameras. That night, I received a call from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Judge Daniel Whitlow retired from the bench 2 years ago, once considered untouchable, now whispering through a secure line. "Elijah, she tried to buy my silence too back in '09 during a similar case in Santa Rosa. I refused. They came after my family." I asked if he'd testify. He paused and said, "I'll do one better. I've got files, the kind that never made it to court and the kind that never should have been buried in the first place." The next morning, he sent me a flash drive and a written affidavit detailing how Melanie had manipulated county clerks and exploited judicial loopholes for over a decade. Sarah's team took it straight to a federal judge. Within 48 hours, subpoenas were issued. The local sheriff knocked on Melanie's door, and this time, she didn't talk her way out of it. She was arrested on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and racketeering. The footage of her being led out in cuffs played on every channel that night. But I wasn't done. At the next Crystal Pines community meeting, I stood in front of those same 40 neighbors, only now the room held over 200. Families, teachers, veterans, parents, all asking the same thing. What happens next? I told them the truth. The homes were built on land acquired through fraud, but that didn't make them complicit. They were victims too. So I proposed a solution. We form a new HOA, led by residents. We buy back the development rights at cost, with no profit to any of the shell companies, and I sign over the mineral royalties to a community trust, with funds directed to infrastructure, school grants, and long-term environmental cleanup. The vote passed with 92% in favor. The headlines the next day read, "Fraudulent. HOA falls. Community rises." Melanie was denied bail after the court discovered she had wired over $5 million to an account in Belize. Her trial was set for early spring, but the network she built was already collapsing. One by one, her partners flipped. James Holloway was arrested in Nevada, trying to board a private jet with a fake ID and a duffel bag full of burner phones. The PR firm dropped her. Carrington Roth quietly settled out of court. My land began to heal. The old silo became a small museum, telling the story of what happened. The plaque out front read, "Dedicated to those who refuse to be silenced." Underneath that, the name of Margaret Lane in bronze. The woman who saw it all coming. The woman who left behind not just land, but a plan. And the man who executed it. Her nephew. 6 months later, I sat on the porch of the only structure still standing from the original ranch. A small guest house, barely big enough for a twin bed and a coffee pot. The same one my aunt used when she spent early mornings journaling before the desert sun got too high. Now the air was cooler, softer, and the wind carried the sound of kids playing down by the new community garden. They'd built it on the edge of Phase 3, where the developers once planned to put luxury condos. Instead, there were sunflowers, tomato vines, and a plaque that simply read, "From stolen ground, we grow together." Audrey sat beside me sipping iced tea, her once shaky hands now steady, her voice calm, even when she talked about the class action cases she was now managing across 3 states. She had become a voice for victims and a nightmare for corrupt HOAs, and she credited it all to my aunt and a man who refused to walk away. The FBI investigation had expanded into 6 states. Over 20 indictments had been issued. Several officials stepped down quietly, some not so quietly, and 2 judges were now facing ethics panels. James Holloway had flipped early enough to save himself a life sentence, but not his reputation. And Melanie Carter, well, Melanie was now inmate number 48,217 AR, serving 27 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Her plea deal fell apart when recordings surfaced of her discussing offing whistleblowers and bribing city officials. I didn't take pleasure in seeing her fall. Not really. What satisfied me was what rose up in her place. Crystal Pines was no longer a gated fortress. It was a neighborhood, a real one, with messy lawns, kids on bikes, block parties, and residents who showed up not to enforce rules, but to listen to each other. And the new HOA had a transparency policy requiring all board meetings to be recorded, all finances made public, and no major decision could be passed without a 75% majority. Connell Lewis, the same man who once told me to go back to Boston, now served as community president, and every time he spoke, he ended with the same words, "We're not going back to secrets." The mineral rights were put in a permanent trust. Every quarter, the royalties were split evenly between school funding, park improvements, and a legal defense fund for homeowners across the state. We called it the Margaret Fund. Sarah moved on to lead a DOJ task force on property corruption. Her work had already led to the reversal of over 80 wrongful foreclosures across the Southwest. Audrey opened her own firm and became one of the most sought-after HOA litigators in the country. And me, well, I never went back to my accounting job. I didn't need to. Instead, I helped run workshops for property owners, teaching them how to read their deeds, their rights, their red flags, and most importantly, how not to get steamrolled by a smiling face in a power suit. On the one-year anniversary of Melanie's arrest, the town threw a block party, not to celebrate revenge, but to celebrate what comes after survival. Kids ran through sprinklers, dogs chased frisbees, and a local band played classic rock covers, off-key but full of heart. Someone handed me a mic and asked me to say a few words, so I stood on a folding chair under a string of lanterns and told the truth. That justice isn't a lightning strike. It's a grind. That it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And that power doesn't just corrupt. But most of all, I said this, they thought they were building houses, but what they built was a trap, a legal one. And every signature, every forged form, every lie laid one more brick. They thought they were unstoppable. They forgot one thing. You don't take land from a lane and not expect a fight. When I finished, people clapped, not loud, just steady, like a heartbeat, like something shared. Later that night, Audrey joined me at the old fire pit, where we burned some of the leftover files. Not because we needed to hide anything, but because the chapter was closed. She leaned over and whispered, "She'd be proud of you." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. As the fire crackled and laughter echoed in the distance, I looked up at the stars over Arizona sky and smiled. The land was still ours. The story was still ours. In France, the way it should. Some battles don't begin with fists or flames. They start with a missing letter, a silent signature, a piece of land no one thought someone would come back for. This wasn't just about property, it was about dignity. It was about drawing a line and saying no more. Because when power hides behind rules and money hides behind paperwork, it takes more than anger to beat it. It takes truth, persistence, and people willing to stand up when no one else will. So if you've ever felt small against something too big, too loud, too well connected, remember this: you're not powerless. You're just one step away from finding your voice. And if this story meant something to you, drop a 1 in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, drop a 0 and tell me what I can do better next time. I read every one of them. And if you've ever faced HOA nightmares or stood up to something broken, you're not alone. We fight smart. We fight together. And sometimes, just sometimes, we win. Thanks for watching.